with some friends of mine and some friends that we have here. We're really grateful for you to spend about an hour and a half with us tonight just to discuss some really important things, really good topics, especially in the season that we're in. Before we begin in all of this, I want to make sure that we acknowledge the fact that we're in a very critical time in our country's history at this point. And even in the moment right now, we're hearing and waiting, and depending on when you're watching this video, votes are being counted to declare who the next leader of our country is going to be. And so with that, we know there's significant political discord and political activity that's occurring. And I want you to know that everything that we are about here, whether we're guests or with Epic Movement, that nothing political here is going to, nothing that we say here is going to be politically charged or of that nature. And we take no political stance in Epic or Crew in that manner. And so that's worth noting in the midst of a very trying time. But what we're here to really discuss is the overall goal of the Epic Movement right now is to find out if we can see the Lord bring 500 multiplying holistic disciples to be people who we can train and develop into the people that God wants them to be. And so to do that, we are engaging with multiple topics, such as today, and what we started with last month was discussing what is a multiplying holistic disciple. This month, we're going to be discussing the nature of Asian American history and how that affects our understanding of discipleship and our understanding of life in general, which does bring into a lot of the pertinence of today's time as we are moving forward. So I would love to first of all, have our panel introduce themselves here. And we're just going to jump right in, actually. So as I'm going to ask this first question, I'm going to have our panelists share about who they are, introduce themselves, and then be able to answer the question right after that. And so I'll start with Dr. Lee and moving on to Tommy as well as to Esther afterwards. So our first question that I want to engage with you guys on is that as we are practitioners or theologians, how do you see history itself, or the social context of our day matter to your faith and discipleship? Why don't we start with Dr. Lee?
Yeah, so did we introduce everybody? So yeah, I'm the academic dean of.
Go ahead and
I'm the academic dean of the Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry at Fuller Seminary. I also teach theology as an assistant professor of theology and also Asian American ministries. So thank you, Tony. I'm glad to be here. And this I think first question is really important because I think often we think about it as though it matters for us, and then God should care about it instead of the other way around, right? And I always say, if it doesn't matter for God, then it can't matter for us. But fundamentally in the Bible, it matters so much, right? The fact that we see God at the very heart of who God is. God is the God of the covenant, and God enters history. This morning I was thinking about this verse in Exodus where God says, I will take you, talking to Israel, as my people, and I will be your God. So that idea of God entering history and God of the covenant is so important, as well as God being the God of incarnation and resurrection, the fact that our bodies are saved along with our souls and spirits. I mean, in the Bible is absolutely holistic in terms of how it talks about salvation, unlike how a lot of us imagine heaven to be. We don't float around. That's actually not what the Apostles' Creed says. It says we believe in the resurrection of the body. And of course, we believe in the God of the kingdom. The fact that Christ came, and when we say Jesus is Lord, is actually a fundamentally political statement already, right? The gospel already includes everything in the whole world. That's basically why it touches upon politics along with everything else. So in all those sense, I would say our history and also social context matters, because this is actually where we encounter God. And God's not a dead God, God's a living God. He talks to us where we are.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lee. We appreciate your perspective. So let's move on to Tommy.
Yeah, my name is Tommy Joe. I've been doing full-time campus ministry since 1988. The first 18 years of my ministry was with Asian American Christian Fellowship at ACF on the West Coast. And then 2006, I joined Campus Crusade for Christ back then to direct a ministry called Epic Movement. And I did that for 9 years, and I'm still on the leadership team doing stuff with Epic and also with Crew at large. So I think why, how the social context and history matters as an Asian American leader. Early on in my ministry with AACF, I was asked a question about, tell us about Asian American ministry. And I go, I have no idea. We just do ministry. And somebody from IV basically said, oh, so you're an Asian American doing ministry, not an Asian American ministry. And man, the lights just say bing, 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 bing. And I go, that is so key to what I'm missing in the ministry. So it forced me on a journey to understand who I was as an Asian American in context, and understanding other cultures and other Asian American communities to be able to reach them more effectively. So that's kind of been my journey. And I've been diving deeply into history and how it relates to the gospel, how it relates to theology, how we even read scripture through Asian American eyes, if I can say it that way.
Yeah. Tommy, that's such a poignant statement. Thanks for sharing that. It's easy just to be an Asian American doing ministry as opposed to being an Asian American ministry. So that's a keeper, I think. So Esther?
Which was mine. Somebody told me that. So
No, you're fine. Go ahead, Esther.
Yeah, hi. My name is Esther Kang, and I've been doing ministry a lot less than the people here in this call. So I'm from Oregon, and I went to the University of Oregon, and then after graduating, served in EPIC for 2 years, and I did a year in LA on the SoCal team, and then a year back at U of O. And currently, after finishing my 2 years of interning with them, I am now in seminary studying at Fuller, and learning more about theology and stuff. And I think like my time in EPIC and my time working in Asian American ministry really like brought me to wanting to study it more. Growing up, I didn't really care about history and didn't do well in it. And I feel like it went in one ear and out the other. And even in college, like I wasn't a part of the cultural clubs. Like a lot of my friends were in KSA, and I felt like, oh, like my discipleship and ministry was the highest priority. And so I'm just going to devote my time to that, because culture and history and these things that are important aren't as important as ministry, And so then after my time with EPIC and even taking Dr. Lee's class, I increasingly realized how like important and intersected it actually is. And I feel like, I realized that history informs a lot of who you are, and then through that, who you're becoming. And so, Asian American history is a part of my story. Mm-hmm. And my parents, for example, immigrating here from Korea is just as much a part of my story as something like how the model minority myth came to be, like it informs who I am and how people view me and the power that I hold. And I feel like a lot of times we think like, oh, we're just, people making our own conscious actions and things like that. But the reality is we're part of a much larger narrative. And I think it's so important to study and understand that, to know like who we are now and be aware of that. And so, and also like what Tommy said, like it helps to even see the lens of which you see like God and scripture. And so, I'm still in that journey of like discovering more of that, but slowly understanding more and more of the importance.
Yeah. Well, Esther, thanks so much for being with us. We appreciate just being you on as you represent people who are just on journey about this, And so let's continue on with the conversation, because I think we have a lot to get to, and hopefully we can have some good discussions, and hopefully this sparks conversations that if you'd like to ask more questions, we'll have a Q&A at the end of this. So please feel free to log into the chat to write some comments to us. If you have questions for the panel, that'd be wonderful for us to engage with you. But my first question, another question for you guys is, how do you see Asian American history and context matter to our theology? If I can ask that of Dr. Lee specifically, that Asian American history and context, we're saying it does matter somehow, but really, how does that intersect with theology?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually fundamentally the problem of how we think about theology. We think about theology as like falling from the sky, when in fact, theology is us struggling with God. One of the best descriptions of theology that I've actually learned is Anselm describing theology, St. Anselm in the Middle Ages, describing theology as faith-seeking understanding. Like, I believe in something, but I need to understand what's happening. And the question is, this idea of seeking understanding is the idea of asking questions. Now, like Esther, like when I was in seminary, and even before seminary, I was like, I didn't actually care about Asian American anything. I didn't even care about my Korean American identity. What does it matter? I'm gonna go to heaven. I care about being a disciple of Christ, and all those things. It almost feels like baggage. I mean, especially because I grew up in a predominantly white context in Northern Virginia. So I was like, this is just baggage. It's what causes me pain. And also, I think my family and my church seems to be dysfunctional in different ways, and it's all cultural. I don't want that. I want the pure Christianity. So I went to Princeton Seminary. I went to somewhere I was like, I can get pure, uncontaminated Christianity. When I realized, and this is actually me studying, because I'm an expert in Reformed theology, and me studying Reformed theology, I realized, wait a minute, like everybody in history is studying, asking their own questions in their own context. Why? So Luther's doing theology for the German church in that context. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because I'm studying all this, Europeans, and they're all doing theology for their own context with the burning questions of their time. And here I am doing theology for the burning questions of their time. Like what? How does that work? Right? Why are they doing theology for themselves, and why am I doing theology for them? And I said that makes no sense. And then you realize, oh, theology is not done that way. Everybody does theology. We ask the burning questions of our time. Now, there's one God, there's one universal God, but we're asking questions and interacting questions in that particular, from that particular perspective, right? And I think that's basically how Asian American history and context matters, in the sense that we can't understand ourselves. And there's a distinction here between my own personal history, like my family that came from Korea, like in the early 80s, right? And then Asian American history. And this is a hard concept, but it's the idea of kind of a racial identity, right? The fact that we have our ethnic identities and racial identity. Like I am Korean American and also Asian American. And this has to do with kind of a social formation in terms of how we interact with society. And the fact that I walk into the room and they're like, oh, you're Asian American. I'm like, I guess so. This is the same way in how Nigerian immigrants say, oh, I didn't know I was black until I came to America, because blackness isn't a thing, right? Or like everybody in Asia coming, I thought I was Asian because back in Indonesia, I'm like Indonesian, not Filipino, not anything else. Like it's all separated. But the idea of racial formation helps us, is such a big part of American history that unless you understand this, it's almost flying blind, right? Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's actually a kind of a difficult jump, but you definitely get it longer you stay here, because you realize, wait a minute, I lose connection with my heritage, but then the racial formation actually matters so much. Like later generations of Japanese Americans, Gonseis are like, wait a minute, I know Japanese heritage I'm not connected to, but I realize the racial formation identity matters. And what I tell people is that both matter, matter. And so my own family history matters, like where I came from. And then I've been talking to Tony about how I've been learning about the Korean War, and I won't get to all the nitty-gritties of that, because once again, I don't know that. I don't know that part of myself. Mm-hmm. But I also have to figure out how, Chinese Exclusion Act or what happened to Japanese Americans, that actually matters to us in a similar way, in a very similar sense of how President Obama figured out the fact that he was black, right? Because he was like a Kenyan, like immigrant in a sense, right? And then he realizes, oh, I'm black. And that kind of a revelation has to happen. And a lot of people call this the Asian American awakening. Like you wake up and you realize, oh, this is a thing I have to own.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you saying it in the context of that, because even as I went to, a conservative seminary, and what they actually taught us about theology was very much that theology should be seen as the lens of, it's the queen of the sciences, actually. That it's not necessarily, like I used to read systematic theology and Wayne Grudem like all the time as a freshman in college. And I ate that up, and I absolutely love Wayne Grudem. And as I'd read it, I always think, oh man, this is the truth. This is biblical truth right here. And I found out later that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. That, as you're talking about, it's a struggle. It's a lot of theology is developing how it relates to us as humans, and racial history itself is so integrally connected somehow into those spaces. And so at one point, one of my professors actually said, you can't do good theology without good sociology. And so I think I like what you're saying with that. And one of the things that we've really benefited in EPIC from, Dr. Lee, is you came up with a framework. You came up with a framework called the Asian American quadrilateral that helps us understand history and the Asian American experience. Could you take a few minutes to go through that and share with us a little bit and inform our audience, what is the Asian American quadrilateral?
Thanks for asking that, Tony. I mean, basically what I realized is that there's no simple way of describing what it means to be Asian American. And I developed this like almost 10 years ago when a professor asked me, well, there is nothing unique about Asian Americans. And I was like, no, it is unique, but it's actually multiple things. It's at the intersection of different things, right? So, the analogy I use is that we're like fish swimming in water. And a lot of my students have heard this so many times. But the fish, you don't ask a fish in water what the water's like because there's actually no way to know, right? And so much of our understanding has to be like this awareness of the waters. So what is in the water? And these are the categories I've kind of come up with. I call them kind of like meta categories because they're not specific categories. Because Asian American population is so diverse that if you only target, for example, East Asians or Southeast Asians or whatever, you'll basically end up having a very different understanding of what Asian American means. But it turns out if you use this meta categories, it covers everybody, right? Actually, in some sense, if you actually use these categories, it can actually, if you tweak them a little bit, it'll work for everybody, in America, right? Everybody in the US. But these are the 4 things that I talk about. Asian Americans, no matter what their heritage is, have some kind of an Asian heritage, right? It's a meta category, right? Some kind of Asian heritage. And some of them have, it's actually a lot more close to who they are. And for others, it's like a distant echo. Like you hear something and you're like, there's something there, but I don't really know what it is, but it's definitely it's impacting my life. And so the Asian heritage, and I talk about it being like, Confucian heritage or Buddhist heritage. I mean, we're not trying to be Confucian or we're trying to be Buddhist. It doesn't matter, right? It's just in the water and we're experiencing it. And the important thing or the sad thing is that we don't have words to articulate what that is. So it just becomes a very crude Koreanness or, Japanese-ness. I'm like, well, I mean, what part of Japan are you talking about? Japan's a big place with a long history. So it becomes kind of like the stereotypical way of talking about it, and that's actually not very beneficial. So whatever Asian heritage might be, I mean, actually, this Asian heritage is actually not just non-Christians, because people think, well, it's our like pagan religions. I'm like, not necessarily. If you're Indian American, it might be the Syrian Orthodox, the Martha Church. I mean, it might be Christian heritage that's part of your Asian heritage, right? So it can be complicated. And the next thing is migration experience, in the sense that everybody, I mean, this is to some degree, everybody in the US, except for Native Americans, have some kind of a migration experience. And some of them, like, earlier on, I think when I was developing this, I called it immigration. And I always talk about this thing. I called it immigration as a theme. And I realized not everybody came as an immigrant seeking the American dream. It's like my East Asian bias, right? There are a lot of people who came as refugees. So I started calling it migration. I kind of ramped up on how I understood how refugee experience looked like, right? Because it's a very different way of coming. So in the sense that migration experience has formed us, and there's something about this, and you will see if you read about Asian American migration experiences, it kind of mirrors a lot of like Hispanic experiences, and also even like some of the early what do you call it? Some of the early like European experiences, like, Italians or Germans or whatever, right? So you see some of that. But all the themes that connects, and I think when you overlap migration experience along with Asian heritage, then you start getting something very unique to Asian Americans, right? And the third theme is what I call American culture, which is actually the most amorphous to some degree, because it's talking about Western history and all the things that, American history and American kind of cultural culture that we've absorbed as Asian Americans, being bicultural, but also the perceptions of Asia and all the negative perceptions and representations that we've seen in the media and in our educational system that we've actually absorbed within us, right? So all the negative representation, we talk about a lot of Asian American representation these days, but there actually has been so much non-representation, misrepresentation, or right? So in that sense, we've absorbed that as well. It's in the water. And the last thing is racialization, the fact that Asian Americans got lumped together, right? And we have to kind of navigate often a world that talks about race from or a world that's actually kind of a black and white in a sense. And we have to navigate, what does this really mean? I often talk about how Asian Americans, when they try to do racial justice, they don't know how to enter in because we've been erased for so long, right? So if we learn the history and realize, wait a minute, there are actually previous generations of Asian Americans who thought about this thing and that made sense of it. Then you can kind of figure out why we were erased and how you enter in, because there are other people who've done it before. If you look at the next slide, so I talk about all the different kind of images, that all the different words in a sense that are out there, like so much. The Asian American experience is so complex, so diverse. And in a sense, the Asian American quadrilateral is a way to organize these things. Like I think about it as like putting all these random things on bins so I can manage them, because it's so overwhelming. And then I can be like, oh, this is actually what's going on. I mean, a lot of times, this is how I use them. A lot of times, people use only one or two tools. For example, in the evangelical world, people love to use Asian heritage to describe everything. But it's faulty, because if you only use that, you're being kind of myopic, right? You don't realize the fact that there are other aspects that are actually impacting the Asian American experience. For example, like this idea of, oh, Asians are not politically active or they don't protest because of Asian heritage. When in fact, people in Asia with Asian heritage protest. So what's happening? What's happening with Asian Americans is the fact that Asian heritage, along with racialization in American culture and migrations, it's doing something to Asian Americans in particular to make us more silent, right? And it's a racial kind of cultural formation that's happening, not just a heritage thing. So that's basically generally how I kind of use a tool. And I can sometimes I'll use it to kind of talk about in terms of even how, once again, when I look at like a particular experience or a particular problem that Asian Americans talk about, like lack of Asian American leaders or whatever, I say, well, which tool do we use? Which lens are we talking about? Because certain tools will give us more insight than others. I think in general, and I didn't say this about the Asian kind of Asian Americans, what do you call it, study bit of it or history bit of it, Tony. Generally, what I want to tell people is the fact that a lot of people forget the fact that there's such a thing as an Asian American studies. It's like a whole field. It's been around for 50 years. And many Asian Americans don't know that. People always say there's nothing out there. I'm like, I always tell people there's too much to read. Like, I'm overwhelmed by the books, right? I'm overwhelmed by the research.
Right.
And a lot of people have no idea the fact that there's actually this whole universe of people who get their whole PhDs and who are scholars in this field. So we always think about the fact that there's nothing out there. And in terms of Asian American ministry, there's very few books. But when you connect with Asian American studies, it's like endless amount of books, that we can kind of connect to.
Well, I think you bring up some really good points in the sense that it's something that it's water. I mean, we think of everything as Asian heritage, right? And so everything is about, oh, it's because I'm Asian is why I do this and why I do that. But it's so much more than it's about even outside perception of us that really influences who we are as well. I think it's also worth noting, as you even mentioned, that Asian American, it's not even that if I, as a Chinese American, I was actually born, like my parents were born in the Philippines, has actually not that much in common outside of perhaps we eat rice with you as a Korean American. I mean, there's some things that overlap, but yeah, it's so easy that all of a sudden we're just kind of lumped in the same categories and stuff. And we haven't even talked about our South Asian brothers and sisters yet either in this whole arena. And that would be, we would love to invite them into discussions with us, but that could be a whole nother hour if we had that too. So
yeah, and you should know that when I teach about it, I actually include South Asians and Southeast Asians. Our Asian American Center, when we do everything, our classes, we include Southeast Asians and South Asians, and actually the quadrilateral works for them as well. It just works differently for them, right? That's basically why it's a meta category. It's just all people experience them differently, but they all experience them somehow.
Absolutely. Hey, shout out to our design friends doing South Asian American work. We want to want you to be involved too with all of this. So can we let's go back, let's go into Asian heritage for a little bit, because I think that's something, again, that we've kind of, I think you've used the word essentialize in a lot of these times that we talk, where we've kind of made a caricature of Asian American heritage. You know, why is it important for someone to know the story of our ancestors, and even the story of our people, you know, as that relates to our faith? And so this is a question for you, Dr. Lee, as well as anybody else on the panel too.
Well, I'll just kind of chime in just a little bit, and then we kind of open it up to the people. Two things I say. I tell people that often our Asian heritage gets pathologized, like it's something negative, terrible, right? And this is just generally how American culture, Western culture, sees Asianness, right? So it's just kind of called Orientalism, where we kind of essentialize it and kind of reduce it and say, this is who you are. Like the Mulan movie, it's all about shame. I'm like, that's not how Asians tell their story. So why are we telling their story? I think that's one of the reasons why Mulan did poorly in China. They're like, nobody tells stories this way. Shame, shame, shame. I mean, their shame's there, but we don't obsess about it that way. So we often pathologize it, and I think some Asian Americans idealize it, which is a problem. It's either way problematic, right? Because it's not all bad, nor is it all good. And sometimes what we think is good is bad. Sometimes what we think is good. And so, in this sense, generally what I tell people is that, first of all, you have to know. You need more language to articulate what this is. You have to actually know it, and knowing takes a long time because you have to study this stuff, and you need more language to articulate it. And the other thing is, I tell people, you don't have any rights to critique Asian heritage unless you understand how Orientalism pathologizes everything about it, makes everything about Asian bad. If you know that, then we can talk. Then we can talk about, because we do have problems. Like Asian heritage has problems, but how do you know you're just being played by the culture, a dominant culture that basically says, oh, being Asian is terrible, and Christianity will solve all your problems? That's how it goes. Being Asian is terrible, and Christianity will solve all your problems. How do you know that Christianity is not just racist, which is actually what part of what we're talking about?
Yeah. There's so much within that of just being able to say, like, Christianity is better than your culture, versus no, there's things in our culture that the Lord actually uses, that actually the Lord wants to actually engage with. And that's when we talk about discipleship, that it's so important to how do we bring those out, and also like but redeem the things that do desire the things that we do think we should be pathologized at the same time, right? So but yeah, the same question for anybody else. How about you, Esther? How do you think about relating to your story in your family and your ancestors in this way?
Yeah, maybe to like give my own story of just my parents' immigration. So my parents, they immigrated from Korea. My dad came when he was in high school, and my mom came when she was in grad school. They met in seminary in Texas, and then they moved to Oregon to start a church. And so that even sentence that I just said, like, informs so much of who I am. And like, even the fact that my parents came and studied here means that they are like fluent in English. So I'm second gen, but I don't have a lot of the same second gen experiences that some of my friends have had, where they have to like translate for their parents growing up, or need to like memorize their social security number and do the taxes and things like that. Like, I didn't have to do those things. And so I think that like knowing my parents' immigration story really informs me first. Even to give another example, like when I was in grade school, like, and growing up, I'm having to navigate my parents who did not grow up here and have a completely different culture and mindset in America, versus like my friends and the setting that I'm in. And so if there's like field trip volunteer thing, then I'm like, okay, I know that my mom's not going to do this. And she spoke English fine, but like, she just wouldn't do it. I don't even need to ask her. And it's not because she like doesn't want to help, but yeah. But I don't want to like tell her about it because I don't want her to feel guilty or feel like she needs to. And I don't even know if I want her to, because then I have to like navigate all of that stuff with my white friends. And then, you know, like, yeah, I don't want to tell my parents that, or my teacher that. And so it's just like navigating all of these layers, and I'm like 8, you know? So that like informs a lot about me. And then I think as I'm understanding more of that, like shows me more of also like the God that I see and how I'm able to view others. And so if I grew up at home not being able to complain because like my parents sacrificed so much for me and I should feel grateful, that's really going to impact like myself and how I treat myself, and also impact how I view God. You know, like not being able to complain or lament, and that affects like my intimacy with God, how I read the Bible, all these things. And then also impact my relationship with others, you know, like can very easily become transactional without realizing. And so like those all just happen. And I feel like everyone is doing that. And so being able to like look back and see and understand, starting with my parents, at least for me, helps me be able to unpack like these decisions in the way that I'm like seeing things.
Wow. Esther, you figured all that out when you were 8 years old, huh? Well, obviously, it sounds like you've had to really take a journey from that point of there's so many layers to unpack when you were 8, you know, as an adult now. And that, I mean, that's clearly informed how you even understand your faith and Jesus Christ in all these spaces, because it's a part of the story that you bring in, and how that it's such a rich, it's such a rich thing. So, you know, Esther, thanks so much for sharing that with us in that way. Tommy, I have a question for you as we relate to this. You know, so the other part of the quadrilateral that Daniel brings, that Dr. Lee brings up, is you see that racial history and racialization has a real big component within this. And you know, if anybody knows Tommy Joe, he's very well invested with the Japanese American community in Southern California, and he does some amazing work among them to engage with them on faith, to engage them on Jesus, but also just understanding himself as a person in this space. So for you, you know, how do you see Asian American racial history impact you following Jesus? And how does that help you actually introduce other people into faith? So as it relates to discipleship, right? Introducing other people to faith in Jesus.
Pretty complex question, but it relates right with the question you asked before in terms of our history. And a lot of the history part is the more I know about my history, and I didn't really seek to know about history. I just wanted to talk story, understand people's stories, and found out that was history. And the more I know about that, the more I'm connected to them. If they be German, if they be Italian, Brazilian, whatever, the more I understand about my own story, and the more I can ask questions about their story, the more we find this weaving together and the fingerprints of God. Now, as a Japanese American, I've been here 4 generations. My grandfather on my mom's side immigrated from, actually was born in Hawaii. So he's actually, born in the late 1800s in Hawaii. So I considered myself very Americanized. But all of a sudden, we were very much an American family. And this isn't me growing up in this era, but 1941, December 7th, Japan attacks the United States. And then a few months later, FDR declares 9066, and with a pen stroke, incarcerates 120,000 Japanese Americans, and great majority of 2/3, 3/4 of them were U.S. citizens. And just with a stroke of a pen, our citizenships, our rights were stripped away, and we were thrown off into prison. And that affected us dramatically as a Japanese American community. As an adult now, I look back, and when you talk about, hey, what camp were your parents in? We're not talking about summer camp. We're talking about incarceration camps. And when you talk about those, there's these stories that link everybody. And I know my mom and dad generation, they were able to say stuff, and then they would go, what camp, what block, and what area, and and they were able to almost like a zip code of find people just through those little quick conversations. So we're very interlinked. But there's been a lot of wounding in the church too. Like, where was the church in 1942 when we were being taken away? And then I apply that to today. Where is the church today? When we see injustices or perceived injustices, there's definitely pain. Whether it's justice or injustice or not, that's really not an issue for me. Really, the issue is that there's pain, and we need to relate to that community. So then how do we relate to that? How do we be bridge bearers of that? So part of my understanding of faith, my ethnicity and my history, the quadrilateral, is able to communicate the gospel in a way that has these links. Well, your fingerprints, I could see the fingerprints of God in your life. Here are the fingerprints of God in my life. Can we join the story? Can we talk about Jesus, how Jesus has intervened in our family? Mm-hmm. And that's just an onboarding conversation to the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. So you're actually seeing how history can weave people together and have that cohesive story that comes together. I mean, as we talk about what struggles we've gone through in this. So
Very much so.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to add into that just for that conversation? Go ahead, Dr. Lee.
Yeah, I want to add something. So what the Japanese American community have done is that they had their own personal experiences, and then a whole group of Japanese American activists fought, right? So, for example, the camps, the U.S. was going to get rid of them. There weren't going to be any trace of them, right? And Japanese Americans said, oh, no, if you get rid of them, we will literally forget this thing. They had to fight for this, right? So I think there's an idea of personal history, and then there's a critical history in terms of like, wait a minute, I have to recover what I didn't learn in my classroom, right? What I didn't learn. And this is real history that we just don't know about. And that history, you literally have to learn. You might not get it in your family background, right? Like in terms of like what the USC policies were, how that impacted the world. I mean, and these things, I think we have a lot. Our educational system doesn't really do a very good job. I mean, basically, our educational system is basically whitewashed, right? So it doesn't really have enough of Asian American history on there, and therefore we don't actually understand the dynamics of what this looks like. And often, like I said, it's not family personal history or your experience. It's something beyond that you have to go and learn about. That critical history is so important. And also, I think what Tommy mentioned is the fact that, I mean, in the end, the reason why we talk about this whole thing is because it matters for discipleship. There are particular wounds that sometimes generic discipleship material does not really articulate. Particular sins that we have. This is basically my thing that I always say. Why does it matter? Particular wounds that God needs, we need particular healing for. We have particular sins that we need God to transform, and we have a particular vocation. Japanese Americans who understood and owned their history about the incarceration, they became activists and they supported that from people. But there were a lot of Japanese Americans who said, oh, you know what? We will try to become as white as possible, right? And erase this whole history. For them, they don't want to be politically active. They don't actually want to be there for the marginalized people. Like, I don't want to be connected to those people. And so it does matter what we do with history.
So I want to, something on that, Daniel, is very important, that my parents' generation, by and large, they're the ones that suffered the incarceration directly. They saw their parents, or my grandparents, everything pretty much stripped away economically and socially. And when they came out of camp, they just put their head down and wanted to work and didn't want to make a splash, didn't want to make waves. So they just worked. They just wanted to prove themselves as American. And it wasn't until their kids, a generation a little older than me, but their kids who really fought for those rights, who wanted to not retell, but to tell history and the impact of what happened politically and all those issues. And they fought for the term called redress and reparations. And then they spawned the Asian American Studies programs at UCLA and Berkeley. And those are huge. Now, having said this, my burden is to understand as an Asian American, what are the other Asian American communities that yet to tell their story? And one of my biggest burdens is understanding, how do we get the Southeast Asian community who have suffered those wounds, who don't really want to talk about it because they're in that healing stage still. But how do we get them to be able to articulate story, to preserve their story, to ask their parents? Difficult, but to have those stories come out and be preserved and watch the fingerprints of God just come from those and to shape their salvation story. So I think my challenge to my friends who are haven't done that history yet, some of the Southeast Asian community, the Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodian communities, it's really important to get your stories down on paper. Talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, videotape these stories, and just have them come and have them be preserved. It's going to be very important, especially as you tell your kids the story of how they came here. I'm kind of passionate about this, as you can tell, but I just you'll see the fingerprints, the fingerprints of God come out through that process.
I think that's a beautiful thing, Tommy. And I know that as I grew up in Middle America, that when we studied history, it always had a very positive spin towards how we saw American history. And, I consider myself at least a loving patriot of this country, but there is something to looking at the negatives of what's gone on, because no history is perfect.
Exactly.
And I think that that's something that is easy to avoid. But when you avoid that, I think what you miss out on is the fingerprints of God. Is that we can easily mythologize, our history in such a way that it becomes this conglomerate of joy and happiness. And I mean, that does perhaps like make me think about America slightly differently, but it also is saying, I want to see the negatives of what I've gone through, or what people have gone through in America, and be able to see how God's trying to redeem all of that as well, versus just simply, let's all go negative versus let's just all be about positive. There's something in the middle where we can address history in that manner that we can draw Jesus from. And that I think really helps as we think about our discipleship. A question directed for you, Esther. As you're working at University of Oregon, how have you seen your short journey into Asian American history? Because obviously you probably wouldn't consider yourself any kind of expert on Asian American history, but the little that you've brought in, how has that affected your ministry when you were doing ministry at Oregon and other places?
Yeah, and so to give context, I think I mentioned, U of O demographic is pretty white. And so there's just, naturally a very large pressure to assimilate. And I mean, I felt that when I was a student too. And so I think before U of O, I was in LA. And so I think that was a really pivotal year for me that I see the Lord's fingerprints on, in being able to really understand, the importance and understand how God has made me specifically, like Esther Kang, a Korean American woman, the voice that he's given me. And so many things that I have assimilated to, or just erased, or didn't think that was important. And so that's why I wanted to go back to U of O, because I realized that there weren't that many minority voices there. And so then when I became the movement leader there, we started implementing a couple of different things. And so for one of them, we had community groups that met, different community groups that met throughout the week. And so then once a term, we had something called Epic Family Community Group. And we would specifically talk about culture and faith. And so I remember the first one, a few brave students volunteered to cook pots of Japanese curry. And then we had people volunteer their rice cookers and a big tub of kimchi and random Costco cream puffs for dessert.
Oh, perfect meal. Perfect college meal. Oh my God.
It is dinner time now.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I talked through the Asian American cultural values, and we had discussion groups. And I think it was big for students to experience, maybe for the first time, the two things that felt separated once, faith and culture, being placed together in their safe community, and just having conversations about that. And I feel that's largely part of what Epic is about. And so, to continue on then, when last spring term during quarantine, the Beyond Model Minority Faith material that was made through Fuller and Epic came out, and I was okay, I really want to do something with this. And so I decided to do a class, a 4-week kind of class. There was content for 3 weeks, and it went through really good solid stuff of history and the model minority myth and scripture and racism and all these things. And then for the last week, I intentionally had them do this thing called sharing our stories. And they all had to think about it throughout the course, but make some kind of presentation in whatever medium they chose to share their cultural journey and how God has intersected with that. And so to my delight, people wrote poems, and someone sang a song in Korean and English, and they made PowerPoint slides with pictures and stuff. And even someone made a cooking TikTok of Asian fusion dessert. But in that, we were really able, when we were sharing that space, able to see each other in a different depth than normal, or what I do as normal. Because I think we can have Bible study all the time and, talk about our feelings and our hardships of the week or whatever. And I feel seen in that way. But when we were talking about this, our cultural journeys and the racism we experience and all this stuff, I like realized, wow, I feel like I'm being seen, or people are being seen in a way that I didn't even realize I desired or needed until after experiencing it, if that makes sense. You know, like, like racism and like hurt, like it's like, oh, I feel so normalized to it. And it's until we like talk about it, look at it, we're like, that's wrong. This is why, that I'm like, oh, that actually does hurt. And I didn't realize. And so, yeah, within those things, I feel like we were able to like empower one another. And I wanted students to be able to know that their Asian American voice and the specific nuances that come with that make you who you are. And like that voice is so needed in our world. And I think for Asian Americans, like, I feel like the current is like, a lot of it is like erasure and like, you know, devalued already and being silent, that, you know, being able to swim against it a little bit or try and like help empower the students to know like, no, it's really necessary and don't assimilate. We need this, especially with college students who are like, you know, they're in this malleable time period and then they're going to go out and be the future leaders of our society. Being able to be in a trusted space with them for like 4-ish years during my short time at U of O really felt like a privilege.
Esther, that's really powerful stuff. Thank you so much. We are building that Beyond Model Minority curriculum out even further. And so that is actually in our beta format, but you can come check it out. It's on our website at epicmovement.com. It's on our front page. If you ever want to check that out, we're trying to be able to bring together those two things, Esther. I mean, that's such a beautiful picture of what I think we are wanting to see the Lord use, is that can you bring the activist in us, or the activists who don't know Jesus, to be able to meet with the churched Asian Americans, as you and I, probably many of us, we were more like Tommy's parents, that we didn't really care about Asian American history, or we were just so desensitized to the racialization around us or the history around us that we have no idea of the water we live in. Can we bring those two people together and let Jesus really reign supreme on that? I think that's what a beautiful thing is, what you're doing and what you've done at the University of Oregon. So we're gonna take the last few moments just to kind of allow you guys to share about what the Lord's doing in your life, and then we'll go into a time of Q&A. So if you have questions, please put it on Facebook, on the Facebook chat or the YouTube chat. We'd love to field your questions, get to know you guys, get to hear from you in the audience. But first of all, Dr. Lee, just tell us what you're doing. Tell us what some ways we can support you, get to know you a little bit better, things that you're trying to do right now.
Yes, so the center at Fuller, I mean, we've been at the Asian American Center for Theology and Ministry has been around for about 6 years now, and we offer classes. A lot of people actually take our classes. We have a core class called Asian American Identity and Ministry that a lot of people actually in the varsity and actually and some people within crew have taken as well. And there are a lot of people actually from other seminaries who come and take it, because it's actually a class that kind of gives you, once again, language. Half the class is really articulating, helping people have this cultural literacy, right? We lack this literacy. So to have that, and then second half is theologically, how do we kind of connect those things? We offer that every winter quarter, January to March, and it's actually online, so every year. So that's something we're doing. We have this podcast called the Centering the Asian American Christian Podcast. You can actually search for it. We have it on, any kind of podcast website. You can basically search for Centering. So that's something we're doing. At this moment, actually, it's quite exciting. The fact that I've been working on editing this reader of the first Asian American Theological Reflections. This is like 50 years ago, from 1970s, right? It was called the PAX Reader. There used to be this Asian American Center called Pacific and Asian American Center for Theology and Strategies over at Graduate Theological Union over in San Francisco. And they had it like 50 years ago, right? And then it kind of died out. And they have the theological, reflections from then. And it's kind of Xerox copied and put together, but I'm actually editing it so we can actually publish it. And actually, when we get it done, it'll be online and available for everybody, right? So that'll be amazing to read how people were thinking about theological, Christianity and their faith 50 years ago, like this actually existed back then. And we want to recover that history and be like, what were they thinking? Because you'll see some of the things they say applies to where we are now. We're like, I mean, it's kind of depressing. You're like, oh my gosh, this is actually applies to where we are. So I think that's basically one of the big projects we're working on right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. We're looking forward to a lot of the stuff you're producing. And again, you can get to know him if you go to any of the links that we've posted here about the Asian American Center at Fuller, and be able to get to know him a little bit more that way. Esther and Tommy, would you guys be willing to share? We've shared a little bit about the model minority faith, beyond model minority faith curriculum, but tell us a little bit more about what you guys are seeing EPIC produce and do for Asian American young people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Beyond Model Minority Faith. A couple of my students called it BOOMF. But yeah, it's a 3-part curriculum, Bible study. Like there's scripture and there's like Asian American history timeline, like a bunch of really good stuff to look through. I guess it's beta right now, but and then after, we took like a lot of EPIC staff over this summer took a short class from Dr. Daniel Lee about Asian American context and ministry. And that was like a water hose of information, like really good, hard, challenging, all of it. And then through that, I think we had like this desire to be able to create something with it. And at least for me, so I don't know if this is true for everyone, but like for me within my ministry context, I think a lot of the material we were using to disciple and like evangelize and things like that were really great, but they were like all crew material that were written by white voices. And these were just the voices that were informing our theology and the way that we do faith. And so, yeah, from all of the things that we learned, we wanted to create something. So many EPIC staff came together every day for some time online in the morning, and great memories. And we made this discipleship content, called Exploring Asian American Faith. And it goes through like different like sections and categories. And I believe that that's online too. But yeah, a lot of it was like new and fresh and like, thought of through us. And like, I even did a section that I took from Dr. Lee's class about like how we interact with our relationship with God and how we see God, and like the specific Asian American like barriers and stuff that can like affect how we see God and how we think of him. And so, that's like a small thing of that. But, it's like a 10-part series, I think.
Hey, Esther, as far as like hobbies you could develop during COVID, creating a discipleship curriculum seems like a pretty good one that you can actually put together. So, I mean, kudos to you. Some of us are trying to like just learn how to sew, but that seems like above and beyond what any of us could think about.
I don't know how we did it. I still don't know, but it came out.
Hey, you guys, the Lord has a reason for all these things, and so I'm glad that we were able to put that together. How about you, Tommy? What do you feel like? What do you see us doing?
Well, I've been since I stepped off as officially being the director and of EPIC the last 6 years now. I don't know how. I still am very much involved with EPIC. I'm still part of the leadership, the national leadership team. And one of the things I do is in partnering and development. It doesn't really. It says nothing, but it says everything. That I'm partnering and development. I get a partner with anybody. And one of the things we did several years ago in our strategic plan with Crew and with EPIC is a lot of our stuff was stuck in Crew, stuck in EPIC. And we realized that we need to get this out to the public. So one of my biggest jobs is to get all of our stuff out to whoever wants it. No charge, just do it. Part of our ministry is getting other people to partner with us to disseminate information and to learn from each other. And it's been really fun. And one of the things I get to do is teach about Asian American history or incarceration stories. So I'll take different churches and groups to Little Tokyo and give them a tour. And through that, tour and talk about the incarceration, but also talk about faith history in the community. Through that, I met some folks at a pilgrimage to Heart Mountain, where my mom's side of the family was last year. And the professor, he's from USC, was talking about Buddhist history in camp. And I go, that's fascinating, because the Buddhists were treated very differently than the Christians. And he has this book called American Sutra, and it's a fantastic book. And I was talking to him, and then he was talking about that his vision was to do something at the Japanese American National Museum about faith history during the incarceration. And he was listing out a bunch of resources. And I go, wow, a lot of those resources are from Japan, not Japanese American specifically. So he didn't ask me, I kind of weaseled my way into this team to consult with Janum to help put together an exhibit opening next year, about issues of faith, both from the Buddhist and the Christian perspective. It's called Sutra and the Bible. And it's going to be telling the story of our faith and community during the incarceration. So that's one of the fun things I get to do with Epic is to give stuff away and to partner to be salt and light in the community. And that's a really fun part of my job.
Yeah, that's great, Tommy. I mean, Janum, by the way, is the Japanese American National Museum in Little Tokyo in Southern California. If you've never been, well, don't travel yet. It's not quite safe. But when you can travel, it's a terrific exhibit. I think that's something to really look forward to. So thank you for.
I will take you on a tour if you want.
Yes.
Oh,
if you haven't done Tommy's Little Tokyo tour, I mean, first of all, your belly will be full, and also you'll be so rich in many other ways as well. So we've done that for places like Talbot and churches and other organizations as well. So we want to be able to bring, and I think the spirit of what you're talking about, Tommy, is that with the Beyond Model Minority Faith, BAMF, okay, that's what our BAMF, and also our Exploring Asian American Discipleship curriculum, all of our resources within Crew and Epic, that's the spirit of what we're doing here, is we want to make these resources available to all people who desire to see Jesus known in this world and to see his kingdom come. So as we're engaging in these conversations, our first priority is ultimately that we want the kingdom of God to be known to all the people, and that includes how we understand our history in all of this. So it's really exciting to be able to engage with you in this. We're going to end officially now, so just thank you all of our guests. However, we will spend the next several minutes to do some Q&A, and so there are some questions that have come in that we want to be able to engage with first. So the first question that we want to get to, okay, so if I'm not an Asian American or I'm white, how do I help my Asian American disciples understand history? So I think that many of our constituents are not Asian as well, but they have connection to the Asian American community one way or another. But this is the first question that's out there. Do you guys have thoughts about this?
I have some thoughts about this. and I would say, well, once again, this whole discussion is all about how do we bring all of ourselves under the lordship and salvific work of Christ. That's basically what we're all about. So it's not something about other things. It's like, how do we bring all of ourselves to be under God's reign, right? So in that sense, how do we help if you're not Asian American and you're like a staff or pastor or whatever? How do we do that? I think the first thing for if you're white or non-Asian American is to know yourself. To know yourself, right? So I would say always start with that, right? There are great books on this. There's a great book called History of White People by Nell Irvin, a painter. There's a couple of books by InterVarsity called Discipling White Church, by David Swanson. White Awake is another book by Daniel Hill. These are great resources. Know yourself first, right? Put that. It's like if you're all those little videos in the airplane, right? Put the mask on yourself first if you help anybody else, right? So this is actually this is the most important part, and then you can kind of learn about Asian American history through PBS series, or there are books about Making of Asian America, a history book by Erica Lee. I mean, because Asian American history is just American history, right? So it's going to help everybody. But I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of knowing yourself, because the idea is the fact that, well, I'm just neutral, I'm just normal, and then I'm going to help Asian Americans. If you think that way, you're going to do more damage than good.
Yeah. Anybody else have thoughts about that?
Yeah, some of my significant mentors were not Asian talking about Asian America. And it's like very similar to the analogy of a fish. When you're outside of the water, you're able to see culture in a very different way. You are different. It is different. It's not critical conversation, but it's an issue where, they're not criticizing the culture, but they are saying, yeah, you do things different. And so a lot of my non-Asian friends have really helped me try to understand the water I'm swimming in. And so I would encourage it. I think that don't shrink away. But as we're looking at the quadrilateral, for example, it wouldn't be something that I'm telling you your experience, but you're asking, hey, this is what we're observing. What are your experiences? And then you're using more of a dialectic method to draw all those questions out. Hey, how have you experienced it? Help me understand this. And I think your students and the people who you disciple will just come alive with, oh my goodness, this person really wants to, is vested and understands what I'm, or is trying to understand what I'm going through. So it's been very positive in my experience.
To add a little bit on a bit of like what Dr. Lee said of like knowing yourself and not thinking that you're neutral and then they're other. I feel like also like the danger in that is like, and that like translates to so much more than just history. It's like, oh, how you view family or how you view, I don't know, significant others. I mean, like hopefully discipleship or mentorship is more than just like, you know, reading the Bible together. And so those things in life come through. And if you are unaware of yourself, then I feel like you think that your way is the one way or is truth. And I think likely your disciple would know and see both and see like, oh, at least that was the case for me. Like, oh, I think this way, but I know that they think this way because they're white, but they are not that aware of it. And so in those kind of ways, like, I feel like it can really impact relationship or even just what feels safe to share. And yeah, to be able to feel like heard and known. And so, yeah, I really double tap that, Dr. Lee. Yeah.
And I think too, as I've had many non-Asian American mentors myself, you know, for me, again, it's someone who was able to step out of the water, you know, and part of my story is actually not valuing myself as an individual. And when I step into at least a culture that does have significant more amount of individualization, it taught me how to value myself as an individual. And so it's almost like I need white people in that way to be able to help engage well something different than what I grew up with. And so I think that if you are white or if you are even another ethnic minority, I think you have stories to connect. You have an ability to connect with an Asian American when you do know your own story in that way. And it's actually a super powerful thing when you can have two different stories intersecting and you see the fingerprints of God, as Tommy mentioned before. So next question. If you have never studied Asian American history before, what 3 events should I start with? There's a lot there, I'm sure. But if we can try to limit it to 3, I realize there could be about 20. But yeah, if you guys have 3 events, maybe if you guys could share what your 3 events might be.
I'll give mine.
History teacher do that.
I'll give mine. I think the first one, and I'll go in non-chronological order because I don't think people realize how important this is. So it's the Third World Liberation Front protests. It was UC Berkeley and San Francisco State College of 1968. I know it sounds, I mean, a lot of Asian Americans, especially Asian American Christians, they think Third World Liberation Front, it sounds crazy. It sounds like some it is left-wing thing, right? But it is so important in terms of Asian American history that if you don't understand what this is, you're gonna miss such a huge part. So I think that's actually one of the most important things. And then of course, it can be, you know, it can be the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. If you study that well, then you'll realize how that connects with the civil rights movement. So that's basically why it's important, the connection to the civil rights movement and the whole package, or it's also called the Hart-Celler Act. And then I would say it's kind of a toss-up, whether it be, you know, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act or the Executive Order of 1942. I'm not really sure. So I just stuck in 4.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. You're one of our guests, so you're allowed to do that. Here's actually a specific plug that's been put out in the chat as well, is that several of friends of Epic with PBS has created a PBS special that I think can give a very good, broad, and yet I think at the same time in-depth conversation about Asian American history. So our friends have produced that. If you guys want to take a look at that, it was really informative, really, really good for us just to be able to understand some of the things some of those very issues, the events you're talking about. Yeah. Do you guys have any other?
I'll dovetail on the 9066 and incarceration of Japanese, because it's such, I think I'm biased, I get it, But I think it was such a traumatic experience, and other Asians felt, dang, if they did it to them, they could do it to us. Mm-hmm. And there is a tremendous amount of reverberations from that one act. And so I think if you understand why, and why didn't they just take the people who are threatening? Why did they take everybody? And what was behind it? And what was the implications? If you can get your mind around that, I think it's a really good base. So that's one. The second one I would do is actually not a specific study, but it's a certain trends. It's important to look at Asian communities and why they're here and what waves they rode to get here. And certain things like what was their migration force? Why did they come here in the first place? Why were the Chinese allowed to come here in the first place and were pushed out? Why were the Japanese allowed to come here? And then, what happened in the Korean migration and the Southeast Asian communities there's two big Southeast Asian migrations. One was post-Vietnam, and then there was post-Vietnam, after the killing fields and things. So there are different waves of Asians who have come here. And then you have another one right before 1998. There was another gigantic wave of Asian Americans who came here. Why? I'm not going to tell you. You got to do your own history. But those are significant issues of the whys behind the big lumps of immigration. And I think you'll understand more of what happened in their countries of origin and how it affects us today.
Absolutely. Hey, by the way, as you're even referencing all those people groups, shout out to our Hmong brothers and sisters, our Cambodian brothers and sisters, Vietnamese. So you guys have a migration story that's very different from perhaps some of our more East Asian stories. And hey, please interact with us because we want to know your stories. We want to know how Jesus has intersected your stories as well as a cultural group, as an ethnic group as well. The Sikh have a very long history in this country, as well as, Mali. I'm going to screw this up, but all of my South Asian brothers and sisters, there's such a unique story. So we want to be able to hear those as well, because it just enriches our experience with the Lord when we hear that. So one more question. How can I find more information about migration experience, especially of specific people groups, since we're talking about that? Yeah, like Koreans, Japanese, Indian, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, a good place to start with, good place to start would be like, Takaki's, A Stranger from a Different Shore, or just like I said, like, I mean, lots of Asian American history books cover these things, right? So, and then you can look at the resources and kind of go look deeper, like the, Making of Asian American History, Making of Asian America by Erica Lee, which is actually more of an updated, kind of popular Asian American history book. So when you pick up one of those books, what Tommy said is really important, because you talk about how they came and what was the U.S. doing, right? A lot of times we forget the fact that Gary Okihiro talks about the fact that even before any Asians came to the U.S., America was already in Asia, right? Because we forget America's like imperial history. So when you look at that, you realize, wait a minute, there was something happening. U.S. was already there, getting into the business of Japan, forcing open Japan, right? Force opening Korea, and and doing different things in China. When you understand that, you're like, oh, this is actually not just everybody seeking the American dream. That's not what's happening, right? Even Southeast Asia, what's happening in Southeast Asia in terms of Cold War dynamics, right? So when you look at that, that's basically one of the reasons why if you read books like Vietnam One, he kind of gives that critical background. It's not just family history. It's like there's a background to what the U.S. was doing, and it was not all clean. It was really, really messed. Even our standards, when you look back, you're like, and this is not just from an Asian American perspective. It's just like it's just what U.S. did during the Cold War, for example, and the pre-Cold War. It wasn't like it was a good thing, even from our standards, right? So I think it's something you want to look into, and to do that, you have to look at these things. And if you're a college student, you can actually just take history books as well, history classes as well, especially if they have Asian American history classes.
I got a hot one on that one, Daniel. It's not just what U.S. or the Europeans did to Asia, but it's what other Asians did to other Asians.
Yes,
all my, my early part of my ministry, I go, why does everybody hate the Japanese? And then I started to do history, some research. I go, oh my goodness, there was so much. And it's not just the Japanese, but there's just so much turbulence and war and just yuckiness that we've all in our history have committed on each other. Yeah. And if you don't understand those micro histories, they're not micro histories, but if you don't understand those currents, how other Asians affected Asians, you'll be a little bit off on your understanding of Asian America, because why can't I date Esther? She's Korean and I'm Japanese, or something like that. Why does a parent? I mean, there are issues still that linger, right, and I think we need to understand what Asian history has done to affect our history in America.
Right.
And talking about that as a Korean American, I mean, what did Korean soldiers do in Vietnam? I'm like, if you don't know, Google it, and it will not be fun. It will not be a fun story. My dad served in Vietnam as part of the Korean army that went to Vietnam, right? So this is actually personal history for me. And I remember his stories. I'm like, that is not good, what we did in Vietnam. So, I mean, it's all kind of intertwined, right? What does it look like? And how do we kind of own this as part of our personal history?
Right.
And by the way, Tommy, this is a snippet. We talk about Japanese occupation of Korea. There's all these collaborators in Korea who allowed that to happen. So it's not like, Japanese just came in out of nowhere. There are all these people internally who actually allowed it to happen as well. So it's actually just a mixed bag of all this history that we have to kind of uncover.
Well, as we're talking about this, we are in the political season, but we have to realize too, even as I think about even Chinese history in relationship to communist China, affects how we see, as an Asian American, as a Chinese American, how I see politics about socialism or Marxism or anything like that. One way or another, it affects it. And I think that even now, as we're talking about that, it affects a great amount. And we have to be aware of it. It's not about judging one way or the other. It's about being really aware of what we bring into our faith as that relates to these things. So one last question that this is a really good one, by the way. So as Christians, how do we reconcile some of the conflicts, in quotation marks, between our cultural tradition and faith? For example, ancestor worship. And is there room to keep these traditions without compromising our faith?
Who asked that? Yeah, I wrestle with this. My family background is actually in the mortuary business, my mom's side of the family. And there's a Christian side to the mortuary business, but they interact with the Buddhist community. And there's this whole, like, what is culture? What is faith? What is syncretism? And all this weird, not weird, but difficult conversations in the middle. And a lot of anthropologists, as you study anthropology or Christian anthropology or missiological anthropology, they'll talk about issues of, form and meaning and, what are the functions and allegiances. And so it's really important to get your allegiance to Jesus straight. Our allegiance is to Christ. And some of the things on the side might look a little bit weird, but really where is our allegiance? It might not even look Christian from the outside, but our hearts, if we're grounded in faith in Christ, that's what and the form might be different. The form might look odd, quote unquote, or pagan, but in actuality, it's focused on Christ. And so, there's a lot, this is a whole 3-year degree at Fuller to do, and if you want to take a missiology degree, but it's complicated. But as you understand the focus on Christ, there's a lot of freedom to be able to live as an Asian American and to go to a cultural thing that might have Buddhist roots, but to be grounded in my faith and to celebrate that part of my culture. So that's a huge discipleship question. But that's just a skim.
Yeah. Esther, did you want to share some as well? I think you had some.
Oh, thanks for giving me opportunity. I have very little to add. I'm in this learning journey with you guys, audience members, and so it's really good what I'm listening to.
Okay. Yeah. How about you, Dr. Lee?
This is where, because like, for example, like piano was a pagan instrument, right? guitar was necessarily like, because organ was ordained basically, but these instruments were like bar
it used
instruments,
to
right?
vibrate the loins of the listeners. That was not a good.
Yeah,
instrument
so
at
I
first.
think people think about the divisions of these things and culturally, and I think the question is, what does it look like? How do we once, like Tom is talking about, have allegiance in a way that we can actually come to understand the lordship of Christ, and also how do we kind of have all of ourselves redeemed? And actually that can be anything, right? Because people, you can't divide up the holy instruments from the unholy instruments. I mean, people have done that in history, but it's nonsense, right? And so this is, in this sense, because I was such a big fan, and I grew up with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. This is the example that I always use. I'm like, they're using such, like, all their stories are really like, Nordic, like pagan religious metaphors, right? But they're doing something Christian with it. And I think the question is, this is actually what church has been doing all along. Sometimes things get Christianized, like the Christmas tree. That's actually literally a Nordic pagan tradition that I think some people has Christianized altogether, right? Did you know that before German immigrants, nobody had Christmas trees? And actually, people didn't think that people should decorate things before Christmas, right? Because like decoration is actually kind of a pagan thing. When German immigrants came, they started bringing the German Christmas trees because they thought that's how they contextualize the gospel with all the Nordic religions, pagan background. So when we look at these things, we worry about Asian religions, like in Asian heritage, but we don't realize the fact that Europe's done this already. People have done this all over the place. That becomes erased and becomes normalized. So when we've covered that history, the fact that this has actually been going on everywhere, then you realize, okay, what do we do with our cultural heritage as well? That's how we want to think about it. Not like, what do we do with our pagan stuff when everybody else is normally Christian? That's actually not what's happening. And when you recover history.
Yeah. That I think you guys are bringing a really good point
on this subject.
Oh, I know, it's a lot. I mean, for me personally, one of the things that I've recognized, even as my dad actually did come to a saving faith in Christ several years ago. And, my boss, Margaret Yu, shared a book with him from Henry Nouwen, one of the great spiritual formation directors of our time. And my dad was reading it on a cruise ship a couple years ago. And I talked to him, I'm processing with him about, as he's growing in his faith, what is he reading about Henry Nouwen? And he says to me, yeah, I like it. It's good. It's just that I learned a lot of this in Buddhism. And so I just started seeing like, gosh, I probably syncretized a lot of my my Western American faith into this. I guess, okay, I'll take it, because the Spirit of God uses even something like that to really be able to bring my dad into a place that he's closer to Jesus, and so he's got an immense prayer life because of that now. So it's just, I think that's something that God can redeem, even the forms and the functions of when we are just strictly about paganism or these issues of culture, and so yeah, it's a tough soup to navigate, but it is worth navigating, and it's never about like coming to solid conclusion. I think is what I hear from you guys too. It's like, everything is a little bit different in that sense. So
yeah,
okay.
And adding just a bit right there, I mean, because Thomas Merton and the whole contemplative tradition drew so much and had that conversation with Buddhism as well and Eastern traditions. So, I mean, in that sense, this has already happened before, right? In the 60s with Merton, and he brought so much of that connection because so many people were interested in Eastern religion. So, this is not something new. There are actually so much resources out there that, once again, that we can read that we don't know about.
Yeah. For the sake of time, I think what we are looking at right now, and I realize that there's more questions that have come through the chat, and we'll do our best to interact after this broadcast is done. But I just want to say thank you and respect the time of our guests, Dr. Lee, Esther, and Tommy. Thank you guys so much this has been such an enjoyable conversation. Just being able to engage with you on something that perhaps, in our Asian Christian worlds, we don't engage with enough on, or we're afraid to, or we're afraid that it could lead to these different angles. So if you enjoyed the conversation as our audience, please subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. We'll be having this type of content once a month at least, if not more so for other pieces that come up in our YouTube channel. You can interact with us. We'd love to get to know you. All of our resources will also be linked into what was documented here. So we want to just, again, share the wealth with you all. Please send your friends to this recording if you haven't had a chance to be with us. So we will be previewing next month as well. We'll be talking about discipleship and the role of mental health as well. And so in the light of COVID season, in the light of what we call racial trauma, in light of just being stuck at home and all of these things, how does that affect us in our emotions and our mental state as well? So we look forward to talking to you then. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for spending time with us. Esther, Tommy, appreciate you guys so much. I'll pray just to close us out as we end this. God, thank you that you have provided people who want to be discipled by you, Jesus. We pray that every student, every person that listens in gets a vision for how they can grow closer to Jesus through Asian American history and the Asian American quadrilateral, and understanding who we are, because that's what you made us to be, God. So we just pray for everyone listening that you would be able to experience who God made you to be through the history that you made, how God made you, and how we can really intersect with the fingerprints of God. In your name we pray. Amen. Appreciate all of you guys.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, audience. We appreciate you. Take care.